one cannot do justice to the Royal Navy's contributions during World War II in just one video. As such, we've decided to focus on the role of the Royal Navy on possibly its biggest front, the Battle of the Atlantic, as well as its submarine division, particularly in the Atlantic and Northern European theater of war. People tend to forget just how isolated Britain was in the first 2 years of the war in the fight against Germany. Much of Western and Central Europe had either been conquered by Germany or were its ally, or were forced to be neutral at best. The United States only formally entered the war almost at the end of 1941. Britain desperately needed supplies, both military and civilian. It depended heavily on military armaments and supplies and manufactured goods from the United States. Britain was also heavily dependent on oil shipped via Venezuela and oil refineries located in British and French colonies in the Caribbean. All of these were sent to Britain via massive convoys that plied the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. Equally important in these convoys was the role of Canada, which supplied its share of agricultural and manufactured goods, including steel, and which was an important Commonwealth ally. In fact, the majority of convoys were from Halifax in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia. Without those North American supply lines, the British war effort simply couldn't have survived against the onslaught by Germany. It's therefore not at all surprising that the Germans immediately honed in on these supply convoys from North America bound for Britain. In fact, they did so from the very start of the war. That explains why the Battle of the Atlantic is always touted as being the single longest battle of World War II, stretching as it did from the very first day of the war, in September 1939, to the very last day of the war, in May 1945, between Germany and Britain. It was the only battle to last the entirety of World War II. Worth noting is that convoys that were vital to Britain also came from other parts of the British Empire, namely the port of Freetown in West Africa, in what is today Sierra Leone, and the port of Gibraltar on the western edge of the Mediterranean. These too came under attack by U-boats, which the Royal Navy did its best to protect with its vessels in the Bay of Biscay off France. The German plan was very simple and just as deadly. Its fabled submarines or U-boats would do little else than wage constant attack and counterattack against convoys in the North Atlantic. These German submarine attacks would soon evolve into even more fearsome tactical strategies known as wolf packs. As the name suggests, instead of only one or two U-boats attacking a convoy at a time, in a wolf pack, a whole group of them would do so, going back and forth in attack like a pack of wolves. This attack strategy had already been used in the latter part of the First World War, more than 20 years before. But the U-boat wolf packs of World War II were far more deadly, sinking hundreds of Allied merchant ships, particularly at the beginning of the war. The British provided anti-submarine escorts up to 200 miles or 320 kilometers west of Ireland. Coming from the other direction, cover was provided by Canadian warships to convoys leaving Halifax. Not all British escort ships were traditional Royal Navy vessels. Protection was also offered by armed merchant cruisers, which were merchant vessels that had been refurbished into temporary naval warships. Particularly important to the British was the area known as the Western Approaches. This is a roughly rectangular stretch of ocean to the west of Ireland and Britain, which, as its name suggests, marks the region of approach in the North Atlantic for vessels making their way to the British Isles. For that reason, Royal Navy aircraft carriers were often deployed for anti-U-boat sweeps throughout the Western Approaches. These became more and more effective as the war raged on, particularly from late 1943 onwards. It is estimated that as many as 100 convoy battles took place in the Atlantic between 1939 and 1945. The cost was immense. By the end of the Battle of the Atlantic in May 1945, the British and its allies had lost more than 2,200 merchant ships, as well as 100 Allied naval vessels. More than 30,000 merchant seamen had died during those 6 years, with thousands more officers and sailors of the Royal Navy and Allied navies also losing their lives. In 1939, the Royal Navy submarines were primarily based in China, the island of Malta in the Mediterranean Sea, and in British waters. The submarine branch of the Royal Navy had a total of 5,150 men, which accounted for less than 4% of the Navy total. In the first few years of World War II, The primary objective of the Royal Navy was overcoming Germany's U-boat supremacy, particularly in the Atlantic, including the North and Baltic Seas. The most reliable anti-submarine weapons that the Royal Navy had at commencement of war were stern-dropped or mortar-fired depth charges. In terms of anti-submarine detection sonar, the Royal Navy had its own variant known as ASDIC, but it was of limited range and of no use in tracking U-boats at surface. The British were further hindered by only being able to sweep for moored contact mines and not the magnetic mines introduced by the Germans. At the outbreak of war, many submarines were stationed in the North Sea to protect the patrol line between Scotland and Norway. This would later extend into the Skagerrak, the sea that separates Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. It was during these exercises in Scandinavian and German waters that the British submarine HMS Salmon sank the German U-boat U-36 on December 4, 1939. It would be the first sinking of a U-boat by another submarine in World War II. These patrols in the Skagerrak region would continue until April 28, 1940. Over 3 weeks during that final month, 17 British submarines, with the help of 3 French submarines and 1 Polish submarine, had sunk 14 German transport ships, a cruiser and a U-boat. Engagement with the Germans using surface ships in the North Sea had proven almost impossible at times, which is why British and Allied submarines had proven so useful in those waters. Coordinated attacks by British submarines in the North Sea and Baltic Sea had proven so successful that many U-boats had to be rerouted from the North Atlantic so that they could protect German convoys to and from Norway instead. Even so, unlike their counterparts in Berlin, the Naval High Command in London had proven reluctant in investing more heavily in submarines. Why there was so much reluctance to invest more heavily in subs by London is debated. The Royal Navy believed more in large capital warships as well as investing in its naval aviation capabilities. However, this is particularly bewildering when one considers how much damage U-boats were already inflicting on convoys bound for Britain by early 1940. Instead, for most of 1940, Royal Navy submarines were mostly deployed as patrols in the Bay of Biscay, primarily to assess the looming German invasion of France. They were also used as a deterrent to any possible threat of German invasion of Britain, something that was a constant fear to the British for most of 1940. However, as the threat of a German invasion of Britain abated, British submarines increasingly turned their attention to trying to counter the U-boat threat in the Bay of Biscay and beyond. During this time, there were frequent skirmishes with U-boats in which 6 British submarines were lost, as well as 1 submarine each from France, the Netherlands, and Poland. Britain's relative paucity in submarines was somewhat alleviated when the United States Navy transferred 9 R-class and S-class submarines to the Royal Navy between 1941 and 1942. However, instead of being mostly deployed in the North Atlantic to protect convoys, British submarines were used more extensively to protect convoys in the Arctic headed for the Soviet Union. It was an attempt by the Royal Navy to deter German warships lurking in the Norwegian fjords, but this did not prove to be particularly successful. By September 1944, there were 25 operational submarines in British waters. These subs were confined to anti-U-boat patrols in the North Atlantic, as well as attacks against German shipping along the Norwegian coast. The final success in the latter operation would be the sinking of U-486 by HMS Tapir off the coast of Bergen, Norway, in April 1945. That was the last U-boat sunk by a British submarine, just a month before Germany capitulated and lost the war. Worth noting is that of the 780 U-boats sunk during the war, 275 of those hits were accredited to the Royal Navy. That means more than 1 in 3 U-boats were sunk by a Royal Navy vessel. Many of these in turn would have been by British submarines. To conclude, one cannot underestimate what a huge threat the U-boats were, especially in the first 3 years of the war. The British Prime Minister himself, Winston Churchill, would later remark, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." In the Atlantic, it was British warships, improved tactics, and the cracking of the Enigma code that eventually overturned the crushing superiority of Germany's U-boats. And in the North Sea, it was British submarines that played their role in fighting U-boats and crippling German shipping.